Secret Life of Bees, Chapter 13, pages 262 to 276. I sat on the side of the tub while Rosaline dabbed my arm with a stinging icy swab. She plastered a Band-Aid across it and said, "There, you won't die from blood poisoning at least." She closed the medicine cabinet over the sink, then shut the bathroom door. I watched her take a seat on the commode, how her belly dropped down between her legs. When Rosaline sat on a toilet, the whole thing disappeared under her. I perched on the side of the tub and thought how glad I was August and June were still in their rooms. "All right," she said. "Why did you throw all that honey?" I looked at the row of seashells on the window ledge, knowing how truly they belonged there, even though they were 100 miles from the ocean. August had said everybody needed a seashell in her bathroom. To remind her of the ocean was her home. Seashells, she said, are Our Lady's favorite items next to the moon. I went over and picked up one of the shells, a pretty white one, flat with yellow around the edges. Rosaline sat there watching me. "Any time now," she said. "T-Ray was right about my mother," I said, hearing myself say the words, feeling sickened by them. "She left me. It was just like he said. She left me." For a second, the anger I'd felt the night before flared up, and it crossed my mind to slam the shell against the tub, but I took a breath instead. Throwing fits wasn't that satisfying, I'd found out. Rosaline shifted her weight, and the toilet lid squeaked and slid around on top of the seat. She raked her fingers over the top of her head. I looked away, at the pipe under the sink, at the smudge of rust on the linoleum. "So your mother did leave after all," she said. Lord, I was afraid of that. I lifted my head. I remember that first night after we ran away down the creek, when I told Rosaline what T-Ray had said. I'd wanted her to laugh at the very idea of my mother leaving me, but she hesitated. "You already knew, didn't you?" I said. "I didn't know for sure," she said. "I just heard things." "What things?" She let out a sigh, really something more than a sigh. "After your mama died," she said, "I heard T-Ray on the phone talking to that neighbor lady, Mrs. Watson. He was telling her she didn't need to watch after you, that he'd gotten one of the pickers out of the orchard. He was talking about me, so I listened." Outside the window, a crow flew past, filling the bathroom with a frantic caw-caw, and Rosaline stopped, waiting for it to die down. I knew Mrs. Watson from church, from all the times she stopped by to buy peaches from me. She was kind as she could be, but she'd always looked at me like there was something incredibly sad written across my forehead, like she wanted to come over and scrub it off. I clutched the side of the tub as Rosaline went on, not sure I wanted her to. "I heard your daddy tell Mrs. Watson, 'Janie, you've done more than your share looking after Lily these past months. I don't know what we would have done without you.'" Rosaline looked at me and shook her head. "I've always wondered what he meant by that. When you told me that T-Ray said about your mother leaving, I guess I knew then." "I can't believe you didn't tell me," I said and folded my arms across my chest. "So how did you find out?" Rosaline asked. "August told me," I said. I thought of all that crying I'd done in the bedroom, holding fistfuls of her dress in my hand, the monogram on her handkerchief scratchy against my cheek. "August," Rosaline repeated. You don't see Rosaline looking dumbfounded that often, but that's how she looked now. "She knew my mother back when she was a little girl in Virginia," I explained. "August helped raise her." I waited a few seconds, letting it soak in. "This is where my mother came when she left. When Mrs. Watson took care of me," I said. "She came right here to the house." Rosaline's eyes grew even narrower, if such a thing was possible. "Your mother," she said, then stopped. I could see that her brain was struggling to fit it all together. My mother leaving, Mrs. Watson watching me, my mother returning, only to get killed. "My mother stayed here 3 months before she went back to Sylvan," I said. "I guess one day it finally dawned on her. Oh, yeah, that's right. I've got a little girl at home. Gee, maybe I'll go back and get her now." I'd heard the bitter tone in my voice, and it came to me how I could lock that tone into my voice forever. From now on, every time I thought of my mother, I could so easily slip off into that cold place where meanness took over. I squeezed the shell and felt it dig into the pad of my skin on my palm. Rosaline got to her feet. I looked at her, how large she was in that little bathroom. I stood up, and for a second we were sandwiched together between the tub and the toilet, staring at each other. "I wish you'd told me what you knew about my mother," I said. "How come you didn't?" "Oh, Lily," she said, and there was a gentleness in her words, like they'd been rocked in a little hammock of tenderness down in her throat. "Why would I go and hurt you with something like that?" Rosaline walked beside me to the honey house with a mop flung over her shoulder and a spatula in her hand. I carried a bucket of rags and the spick and span. We used the spatula to scrape honey off places you wouldn't believe. Some of it had gotten all the way over onto August's adding machine. We wiped off the floor, the walls, and went back to work on Our Lady. We picked the place up and turned it back the way it was, and the entire time we didn't speak a word. I worked with heaviness inside, and my spirit emptied out. There was my breath curling in hard puffs from my nostrils. There was Rosalind's heart so full towards me it broke through into her sweating face. There was Our Lady talking with her eyes, saying things I could not make out. And there was nothing else. The daughters and Otis arrived at noon, lugging in all manner of potluck dishes, as if we hadn't eaten ourselves sick the night before. They tucked them into the oven to keep warm and stood around in the kitchen sneaking bites of Rosalind's corn fritters, saying they were the finest fritters they'd ever had the pleasure of eating, which caused Rosalind to swell up with pride. "Y'all stop eating all of Rosalind's fritters," June said. "They're for our lunch." "Oh, let 'em eat," said Rosalind, which floored me, since she'd been known to smack my hand sideways for pinching a single crumb off her fritters before dinner. By the time Neil and Zach arrived, the fritters were nearly gone, and Rosalind was in danger of floating off into the atmosphere. I stood numb and plastered stiff in the corner of the kitchen. I wanted to crawl on my knees back to the honey house and ball up in bed. I wanted everybody to shut up and go home. Zach started toward me, but I turned away and stared down the sink drain. From the corner of my eye, I grew aware of August watching me. Her mouth was bright and shiny, like she'd rubbed on Vaseline, so I knew she'd been dipping in the fritters too. She walked over and touched her hand to my cheek. I didn't think August knew about me turning the honey house into a disaster zone, but she had a way of figuring things out. Maybe she was letting me know it was okay. "I want you to tell Zach," I said, "about me running away, about my mother, about everything." "Don't you want to tell him yourself?" My eyes started to fill up. "I can't. Please, you do it." She glanced in his direction. "All right, then. I'll tell him the first chance I get." She led the group outside for the last of Merry Day ceremony. We paraded into the backyard, all the daughters with tiny smudges of grease clinging to their lips. June was out there waiting for us, sitting in an armless kitchen chair, playing her cello. We gathered around her while the lights of noontime bore down. The music she played was the kind that sawed through you, cutting into the secret chambers of your heart and setting the sadness free. Listening to it, I could see my mother sitting on a trailway bus, riding out of Sylvan, while my 4-year-old self napped on the bed, not yet knowing what I would wake to. June's music turned into air, and air into aching. I swayed on my feet and tried not to breathe it in. It was a relief when Neil and Zach stepped out of the honey house carrying Our Lady. It got my mind off the trailway bus. They carried her under their arms like a tube of carpet, with the chain slapping back and forth against her body. You'd think they would use the wagon again, something a little more dignified than this. And if that wasn't bad enough, when they set her down, they deposited her in the middle of an anthill, which started an ant stampede. We had to jump around, shaking them off our feet. Sugar Girl's wig, which for some reason she insisted on calling a wig hat, had slid down towards her eyebrows from the jumping around, so we had to have time out for her to go inside and adjust it. Otis yelled after her, "I told you not to wear that thing. It's too hot for a wig. It's sliding around your head from the perspiration." "If I want to wear my wig, I'm going to wear it," she said over her shoulder. "Don't we know it?" he snapped back, looking at us like we were all on his side, when really we were backing Sugar Girl 100%. Not because we liked her wig. It was the worst looking thing you ever saw. We just didn't like Otis giving her orders. So all that finally settled down, August said, "Well, here we are, and here's Our Lady." I looked her over, proud of how clean she was. August read Mary's words from the Bible. "For behold, from henceforth all generations shall call me blessed." "Blessed Mary," Violet interrupted. "Blessed, blessed Mary." She stared at the sky, and we all looked up, wondering if she'd caught a glimpse of Mary climbing through the clouds. "Blessed Mary," she said one more time. "Today we're celebrating the Assumption of Mary," August said. "We're celebrating how she woke from her sleep and rose into heaven. And we're here to remember the story of Our Lady of Chains, to remind ourselves that those chains could never keep her down. Our Lady broke free of them every night." August grabbed hold of the chain around Mary and unwrapped a loop before handing it off to Sugar Girl, who unwrapped it a little further. Every one of us got to join in taking off a loop of chain. What I remember is the clinking noise it made as it uncoiled in a pile at Mary's feet, the sound seeming to pick up where Violet left off. "Blessed, blessed, blessed, blessed." "Mary is rising," said August, her voice concentrated into a whisper. "She is rising to her heights." The daughters lifted their arms. Even Otis had his arms shot straight up in the air. "Our Mother Mary will not be cast down and bound up," said August, "and neither will her daughters. We will rise, daughters. We will rise." June sliced her bow across her cello strings. I wanted to lift my arms with the rest of them to hear a voice coming out of the sky saying, "You will rise." to feel that it was possible, but they hung limp at my sides. Inside, I felt small and contemptible, abandoned. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the trailway bus. The daughters stayed with their arms reaching into the air, giving off the feeling they were rising with Mary. Then August picked up a jar of Black Madonna honey from behind June's chair, and what she did with it brought everybody back down to earth. She opened the lid and turned it upside down over Our Lady's head. Honey oozed down Mary's face, across her shoulders, sliding down the folds of her dress. A wedge of honeycomb stuck in the crook of Our Lady's elbow. I looked at Rosaline as if to say, well, great. We spent all that time cleaning honey off her, and here they go, putting it back on. I decided nothing these women did would ever surprise me again. But that lasted about 1 second, because next the daughters swarmed around Our Lady like a circle of bee attendants and rubbed the honey into the wood, working it into the top of her head, into her cheeks, her neck, and shoulders, and arms, across her breasts and her belly. Come on, Lily, and help us, said Maybelline. Rosaline had already dived in, and was coating honey all over Our Lady's thighs. I hung back, but Cressy took my hands and dragged me over to Mary, slapped them down in the muck of sun-warmed honey, right on top of Our Lady's red heart. I remember how I'd visited Our Lady in the middle of the night, how I'd placed my hands on the same spot. You are my mother, I'd told her then. You are the mother of thousands. I don't get why we're doing this, I said. We always bathe her in honey, said Cressy, every year. But how come? August was working the honey into Our Lady's face. The churches used to bathe their special statues in holy water as a way to honor them, she said, especially statues of Our Lady. Sometimes they bathed her in wine. We settle on honey. August moved down to Our Lady's neck. See, Lily, honey is a preservative. It seals over the comb and the hives to keep them safe and pure so the bees can survive the winter. When we bathe Our Lady in it, I guess you'd say we're preserving her for another year. At least inside our hearts we're doing that. I didn't know honey was a preservative, I said, starting to like the feel of it under my fingers, how they glided as if oiled. Well, people don't think about honey like that, but it's so strong-acting, people used to smear it on dead bodies to embalm them. Mothers buried their dead babies in it and would keep them fresh. This was a use for honey I hadn't considered. I could just see the funeral home selling big jars of honey for dead people instead of coffins. I tried to picture that in the drive-through window at the funeral home. I began to work my hands into the wood, almost embarrassed at the intimacy of what we were doing. Once Maybelline leaned her head over too far and got honey all in her hair, but it was Lunel who took the cake with honey dripping off the ends of her elbows. She kept trying to lick it off, but of course her tongue couldn't reach that far. The aunts started a single-file parade up the side of Our Lady, drawn by the honey, and not to be outdone, a handful of scalp bees showed up and landed on Our Lady's head. Let someone bring out the honey, and the insect kingdom will be there in no time. Queenie said, next I guess the honey bears will be joining us. I actually laughed, and, spotting a honey-free place near the base of the statue, worked to get it covered. Our Lady was covered with hands, every shade of brown and black, going in their own directions. But then the strangest thing started happening. Gradually, all our hands fell into the same movement, sliding up and down the statue in long, slow strokes, then changing to a sideways motion, like a flock of birds that shifts directions in the sky at the same moment, and you're left wondering who gave the order. This went on for I don't know how long, and we didn't ruin it by talking. We were preserving Our Lady, and I was content, for the first time since I'd learned about my mother, to be doing what I was doing. Finally, we all stepped back. Our Lady stood there with her chains spilled around her on the grass, absolutely golden with honey. One by one, the daughters dipped their hands in a bucket of water and washed off the honey. I waited till the very last, wanting to keep the coating of honey on my skin as long as I could. It was like I was wearing a pair of gloves with magic properties, like I could preserve whatever I touched. We left Our Lady in the yard while we ate and returned and washed her with water the same slow way we'd washed her with honey. After Neil and Zach carried her back to the place in the parlor, everyone left. August, June, and Rosaline started doing the dishes, but I slipped off to the honey house. I lay down on my cot trying to think. Have you noticed the more you try not to think, the more elaborate trying not to think? Have you ever noticed the more you try not to think, the more elaborate your thinking episodes get? Well, trying not to think, I spent 20 minutes on this fascinating question. If you could have one miracle from the Bible happen to you, what would it be? I eliminated the one about multiplying loaves and fishes, as I never wanted to see food again. I thought walking on water would be interesting, but what good was that? I mean, you walk on water. What's the point? I settled on getting raised from the dead, since a big part of me still felt dead as a doornail. All this took place before I even realized I was thinking. I had just gone back to trying again not to think when August tapped on the door. Lily, can I come in? Sure, I said, but I didn't bother to get up. So much for not thinking. Try to be 5 seconds around August and not think. She breezed in holding a golden white striped hat box. She stood a moment looking down at me, seeming unusually tall. The fan on the little wall shelf rotated around and blew her collar, making it flap around her neck. She's brought me a hat, I thought. Maybe she had gone down to the Almond Dollar and bought me a straw hat to cheer me up. But that didn't make a bit of sense, really. Why would a straw hat cheer me up? Then I thought for 1 second it might be the hat Lunell had promised to bake for me, but that didn't fit either. Lunell wouldn't have had time to sew up a hat in this soon. August sat on Rosalind's old cot and placed a box in her lap. I brought you some of your mother's belongings. I stared at the perfect roundness of the box. When I took a deep breath, it shuddered strangely as it came out. My mother's belongings. I didn't move. I smelled the air coming through the window, churned by the fan. I could tell it had turned thick with afternoon rain, but the sky was holding back. Don't you want to see? She said. Just tell me what's in it. She placed her hand on the lid and patted. I'm not sure I can remember. I didn't even remember the box till this morning. I thought we'd open it together. But you don't have to look if you don't want to. It's just a handful of things your mother left here the day she went back to Sylvan to get you. I finally gave her clothes away to the Salvation Army, but I kept the rest of her stuff, what little there was. It's been in this box 10 years, I guess. I sat up. I could hear my heart thudding. I wondered if August could hear it over there across the room. Boom, 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 boom. In spite of the panic that goes along with it, there's something familiar and strangely comforting about hearing your heart beat like that. August set the box on the bed and removed the lid. I stretched up a little to see inside the box, unable to glimpse anything. Through the white tissue paper turning yellow around the edges. She lifted out a small bundle and peeled away the tissue. Your mother's pocket mirror, she said, holding it up. It was oval-shaped and surrounded by a tortoise frame, no bigger than the palm of my hand. I eased off the bed and slid down onto the floor, where I rested my back against the bed. A little closer than before. August acted like she was waiting for me to reach out and take the mirror. I practically had to sit on my hands. Finally, August lifted it up and peered inside it herself. Circles of light bounced around on the wall behind her. If you look in here, you're going to see your mother's face looking back at you, she said. I will never look in that mirror, I thought. Laying it on the bed, August reached into the hat box and unwrapped a brush with a wooden handle and offered it to me. Before I thought, I took it. The handle felt funny in my hand, cool and smooth-edged, like it had been worn down by excessive holding. I wondered if she'd brush her hair 100 strokes every day. As I was about to hand the brush back to August, I saw a long, black, wavy hair threaded through the bristles. I brought the brush close to my face and stared at it. My mother's hair, a genuine part of her body. Well, I'll be, August said. I could not take my eyes off it. It had grown out of her head, and now perched there like a thought she had left behind on the brush. I knew then that no matter how hard you tried, no matter how many jars of honey you threw, no matter how much you thought you could leave your mother behind, she would never disappear from the tender places in you. I pressed my back against the bed and felt tears coming. The brush and hair belonging to Deborah Fontenelle Owens swarmed in my vision. I handed the brush back to August, who dropped a piece of jewelry into my hand. A gold pin shaped like a whale, with a tiny black eye and a spout of rhinestone water coming from its blowhole. She was wearing that pin on her sweater the day she got here, August said. I closed my fingers around it, then walked on my knees over to Rosalind's bed and placed it alongside the pocket mirror and the brush, moving them around like I was working on a collage. I used to lay on my Christmas presents on the bed the same way. There would usually be 4 whole things that T. Ray had gotten the lady at the Sylvan Mercantile to pick out for me. Sweater, socks, pajamas, stack of oranges, Merry Christmas. You could bet your life on the gift list. I would arrange them for display in a vertical line, a square, a diagonal line, any kind of configuration to help me, like they were a picture of love. When I looked up at August, she was pulling a black book from the box. I gave your mother this while she was here. English poetry. I took the book in my hand, leafing through the pages, noticing pencil marks in the margins. Not words, but strange little doodles, spiraling tornadoes, a flock of V's, squiggles with eyes, pots with lids, pots with faces, pots with curly things boiling out, little puddles that would suddenly give rise to a terrible wave. It was staring at my mother's private miseries, and it made me want to go outside and bury the book in the dirt. Page 42. That's where I came to 8 lines by William Blake that she'd underlined some words twice. O Rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. I closed the book. I wanted the words to flow off me, but they had stuck. My mother was William Blake's Rose. I wanted nothing so much as to tell her how sorry I was for being one of the invisible worms that flew in the night. I placed the book on the bed with the other things, then turned back to August, while she reached down into the box again, causing the tissue paper to whisper. One last thing, she said, and she drew out a small oval picture frame of tarnished silver. When she passed it to me, she held onto my hand for a second. The frame contained a picture of a woman in profile, her head bent towards a little girl who sat in a high chair with a smudge of baby food on the side of her mouth. The woman's hair curled in 40 directions, beautiful like it had just had its 100 strokes. She held a baby spoon in her right hand. Light glazed her face. The little girl wore a bib with a teddy bear on it. A spring of hair on top of her head was tied with a bow. She lifted one hand towards the woman. Me and my mother. I didn't care about anything on this earth except the way her face was tipped towards mine. Our noses just touching, how wide and gorgeous her smile was, like sparklers going off. She had fed me with a tiny spoon. She had rubbed her nose against mine and poured her light onto my face. Through the open window, the air smelled like Carolina jasmine, which is the true smell of South Carolina. I walked over and propped my elbows on the sill and breathed as deeply as I could. Behind me, I heard August shift on the cot. The leg squeaked, then relaxed. I looked down at the picture, then closed my eyes. I figured May must have made it to heaven and explained to my mother about the sign I wanted, the one that would let me know I was loved.